Okay, so here we are. I guess this is officially our second lecture. We spend 2 days talking about the endocrine system, and the first day is when we really got through most of the PowerPoint slides on the endocrine system. And that's why I have the to-do list on the board today, is really just making a list of those endocrine glands. I said it would be helpful if we did this for 2 days, just kind of putting a couple of layers down. So you can see on the board what I'm wanting to do is list these endocrine glands. We're going to list the hormones that are released from those glands or either produced in those glands. We're going to talk about the location that those hormones are trying to target and then what kind of response that they cause. One of the themes from last time was that we wanted to point out the 3 different mechanisms of release. I was referring to these as the 3 triggers that would cause an endocrine gland to release a hormone. Hello, you're just in time. And that's a case study that we'll go over towards the end of class today. So that will be after our long discussion of hormones. And just a heads up, anybody in this middle row, you want to be okay with the back of your head being on YouTube. Just a heads up. If you don't want the back of your head on YouTube, then around the perimeter of the room might be a little more. Yeah, I see good, so. Perfect. Then it's fine. Like I said, it's the mic is right up here, so we're not going to catch anything. It'll just be the back of your head. Okay, and you know, I was reviewing the things that we went through last time, and I think we got all the way through our endocrine slides last time, so I'm considering our introduction to the endocrine system complete, and that class handout that we had last time, I've got the key to that up here, so you can always review that to see what we talked about last time in lecture. But where I wanted to go in today's lecture is just listing those glands that we talked about last time. I think we quickly talked about the hormones that those glands produce or are released from, and where those hormones go and what their response is, just by clicking through slides. So I think by writing that down physically today, that might help put another layer in there. I'll try and highlight as we go through those endocrine glands and the hormones that they release, whether they are released due to some type of hormonal stimulus, whether that release is due to some type of neural stimulus or due to some type of humoral stimulus. And then our example at the end of this is just going to be that thyroid case study, which is the only new thing for today. So if you didn't get a chance to grab that, there you go. We'll talk about it at the end of our to-do list. So I'm going to remove the screen in just a second. I just have it here to point out where we are in the semester again. And if I remember correctly, because I have not looked at our D2L page today, I opened up quiz 1 and quiz 2 already. So you've got access to tear through those. I didn't know if we would get all the way through the information today to be able to introduce blood concept map, but I really don't think we're going to get that far today. I'm going to save all of the blood stuff for Thursday. We'll just stick to endocrine system today. So welcome. If you just came in, you haven't really missed anything. I was just going through our to-do list, which is to finish that endocrine list of glands and hormones that they produce. I think we quickly went through them all last time, but we're going to do it again a little bit more slowly today. Then by the end of today, we can consider the endocrine system done, and that sets the stage for at least we have 1 full day to talk about all of the things related to blood. I think I can get all through that in 1 day, but if needed, I might be able to use a little bit of that review time the following day to finish any blood stuff. Remember those review days, I'll try and set up practice practicals that will mimic the real practical that you'll see the following class period. So far, our lab material has just consisted of that organ system survey for the second part of the class, page 49 through 52 in your lab manual. I think we've gotten almost all the way through that when we've broken up into our labs. And there was a few people that stuck around last time where we went ahead and went all the way through it. So if you weren't part of that group last time, feel free to stick around and we'll complete all of that today if you would like. So any questions about our to-do list or where we're at all? If not, I'll remove this screen and we'll just start listing the endocrine glands, the hormones that they produce, and the targets that they go after. So now that I've got a little bit more room here, I just randomly put thyroid gland up here because before you got in here, I was testing to see how much room I had to write these words on the board. I may have to erase our to-do list at some point, but it's obviously just talking about the endocrine glands. We're going to list, as we are about to do, I've got a start on our list of endocrine glands on that side of the board. I think I tried to go down the lab list by starting at the hypothalamus, going through the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland. I think we spent half of our lecture time in the endocrine system talking about all of these hormones from the pituitary gland. And then on the other half of the board, you can see I'm starting with the thyroid gland. We'll see how much we can fit on here, then I might have to erase things and go back over. But that's kind of the game plan for today. Once I get done with this list, I'm going to try and underline the hormones or the endocrine glands and try and highlight whether the release of that particular hormone is due to hormonal stimulus, neural stimulus, or humoral stimulus, which we said was kind of a fluid stimulus. And maybe we can treat this as kind of a review game as well. And if you can't see the things I'm writing on the board, yell at me and I'll try and make them easier to see. Grab a couple of different colors here, and we can start with just this list of endocrine glands and their hormones. I'm trying to fit as much as I can on this half of the board. And the first gland that we have listed is the hypothalamus. And we talked a little bit about this hypothalamus and how it's connected to either the anterior or the posterior pituitary gland. Remember, the anterior pituitary gland is controlled by way of chemical signals, those hormones that have to travel through that portal vein between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. Where there was instead a much more direct connection, a neural connection between the hypothalamus and this posterior pituitary gland. So that aside, let's list those hormones coming from these glands. And in terms of the hypothalamus, I've got a couple of dots here, and then I have releasing hormone or a series of dots, and I have inhibiting hormone, because there's a series of different hormones that come from the hypothalamus that we don't. There's at least 4 or 5 hormones that come from the hypothalamus that we're not making a distinction between, except for the fact that we're saying these hormones that come from the hypothalamus are going to either stimulate the release of certain hormones from the anterior pituitary gland, or they're going to inhibit the release of particular hormones from the anterior pituitary gland. So again, there's that connection, that hormonal control of the anterior pituitary gland. So right off the bat, if we're starting to think about the hormones that come from this endocrine gland, they are going to be stimulated to be released by way of another hormone. So we're going to see this anterior pituitary gland, I guess I will go ahead and start color coordinating these things, are going to be controlled hormonally. So we're going to see the hormonal stimulus for the anterior pituitary gland to release its hormones. I guess we can be a little bit more clear here and even underline this anterior pituitary gland as being controlled by hormones. And those hormones in particular are these releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus. The specific hormones that we need to know, we get into the anterior pituitary gland, and we said there was a list of 7 different hormones from the anterior pituitary gland. And we're going to see that 4 of those, the first 4, I mentioned last time as getting a special name. We call these tropic hormones. And then the other 3 down here, we can consider non-tropic hormones. Tropic hormones, like we said, are just going to be hormones whose target is another endocrine gland. And they're going to get that endocrine gland to, in turn, release more hormones. I don't have a whole lot of room to write here, but let's see how this can go. Follicle stimulating hormone, if we see the target for follicle stimulating hormone, this is going to be testes and ovaries. If we're thinking about follicle stimulating hormone hitting the testes, when follicle stimulating hormone hits the testes, it's going to stimulate spermatogenesis. So stimulates these spermatogonia to divide and produce more sperm. Follicle stimulating hormone, if it hits the ovaries, it's going to stimulate the division of follicular cells. Follicular cell division, just to kind of jump ahead, when we get into follicular cells, we're going to see that follicular cells in the ovary, one of the things that they are going to pump out is estrogen. So you can kind of see this idea of tropic hormones are hormones that target another endocrine gland, and they get that endocrine gland to release another hormone. In the case of luteinizing hormone, it's the same targets. So this might seem kind of redundant, but luteinizing hormone is also going to target testes and ovaries. And the reason I didn't just write this right on top of the two is because I wanted to write down what luteinizing hormone does to the testes. Luteinizing hormone is going to hit certain cells of the testes. We called these interstitial cells last time. So maybe if we want to write that extra note, interstitial cells of the testes, when they're hit by this luteinizing hormone, are going to pump out testosterone. So the release of this testosterone is controlled by hormonal stimulus. Luteinizing hormone in ovaries, we can just say that this is going to be one of the things that stimulates ovulation. I'm saying about day 14 of an ovarian and uterine cycle, but obviously that is not an exact date. The next thing that we have on the list is this Adrenocorticotropic hormone. I know I'm using the abbreviations on here just to save space, and also, just as a review sheet, that last page on the class handout last time, remember, is something that allowed you to at least be exposed to the abbreviations, and on the other side of that, you've got the full names of those. So you can flip back and forth if for some reason one of these is not clear, or you can just yell at me and I'll be glad to clarify. I should also say, one of the easy ways that my brain recognizes tropic hormones from non-tropic hormones is that you can use the acronym FLAT. Like I almost had a flat tire today when I was driving here. I had to go put air in my tire. Otherwise it would have been flat, but the letters FLAT. Follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and thyroid stimulating hormone are going to be all of these tropic hormones that are going after some other endocrine gland, and we're going to see are going to cause that endocrine gland to pump out other hormones. I guess I should have wrote testosterone in an orange color, and I didn't. Next on the list, we said this abbreviation, adrenocorticotropic hormone. This is kind of telling you in its name, the target for this is the adrenal cortex. And I think I mentioned this last time in our lecture, the adrenal cortex is going to be able to release a couple of different types of chemical signals. These are going to be what we kind of grouped. I'll just split these hormones from the adrenal cortex into two categories. One that we called glucocorticoids. An example of this would be cortisol. That's a glucocorticoid. It conserves glucose. I mentioned last time, if you're in one of those stressful situations that you can't get out of, like your arm is stuck in the rock and you are thinking about, do I need to saw my arm off or what? When you're stuck in that stressful situation for hours and can't get away, your body starts to conserve things like glucose or conserve things like sodium. Glucocorticoids like cortisol conserve glucose, and mineral corticoids. An example of a mineral corticoid will be aldosterone. Aldosterone is going to be one of these things that leads to the conservation of sodium. So hopefully we can see those things and I'm not getting a little bit too congested on here. Just to be clear, this adrenal cortex is going to be pumping out other hormones like cortisol and aldosterone if it's told to do so by this anterior pituitary gland. So far we're seeing nothing but hormonal control. And the last one that we've got some hormonal control over, this is our thyroid stimulating hormone. I think we mentioned this one last time. Thyroid stimulating hormone goes to the thyroid, and it gets that thyroid to start to pump out T3 and T4. There's a lot that T3 and T4 do in terms of ramping up the metabolic activity of cells. I'll just say that. T3 and T4 increase cellular metabolism. And that could mean a lot of things, right? Like if your cells are, I just said it again, if you're keeping track. I should not do that. Cells, I won't say it, but anyway, when they're working harder, just like you when you're working harder, when you're working out, if I'm running up and down stairs or something like that, my face is going to turn red, my ears are going to turn red, I'm working a lot harder, my body's going to get hot, I might start sweating. Cells under the influence of T3 and T4 are doing the same thing. It's like they're having an intense workout, right? They're burning through energy, they're operating at a little bit hotter temperature. Okay, so we talked a little bit about T3 and T4. Did anybody remember what cells from that thyroid gland produce T3 or T4? Follicular cells, right? We had follicular cells and parafollicular cells. We should list those on the other side of the board if we can get to details about the thyroid gland. I think we maybe have planted one other thing when we were talking about the thyroid gland before we switched to other things last time. We said there was something funny in the body that has the ability to mimic this thyroid stimulating hormone. It was called TSI. It's called thyroid stimulating immunoglobulins. And I remember that because I launched into our discussion about blood and things we're going to find in the blood, like these little proteins that float around in the blood. And some of them, are antibodies, and they do good for us, helping prevent invasion from foreign cells. But sometimes those proteins that are floating around in the bloodstream can have effects that we don't want. Like this thyroid stimulating immunoglobulin, it's a plasma protein that stimulates the effects of thyroid stimulating hormone. So if it's mimicking thyroid stimulating hormone, it's going to be affecting that thyroid gland, right? It's going to be telling that thyroid gland, pump out a bunch of T3 and T4. That's the issue with Graves' disease. I think we had a slide where we saw that. So this is a plasma protein rather than an actual hormone. Anyway, just mentioning that in case we get into that later. Kind of running low on space, but the rest of these are hormones that are not going to cause the release of some other hormone. Right? Everything else has caused the release of some other type of hormone. Now in non-tropic hormone discussion, we need to remember that, let's see if I can squeeze this in here, growth hormone is going to be going after bones and muscle tissue, and it's going to cause the growth, the stimulation of more cell division for bone cells and muscle cells. So I'll say bone and muscle growth. Melanocyte stimulating hormones. This is going to go to some of the cells out in the integument and stimulate the production of melanin. I'm going to put an S there. Melanin has an N. It's wintertime now, so if you were to catch me in the summertime when I'm outside in the sun more, you would see that there would be more melanin produced and I would have a darker complexion than I do now. Just thinking about melanin production, that this changes at different times of the year. So when it's sunny and it's the summertime, we have more melanin production than we do in the wintertime. Then the last one, which I barely have room to fit in there, maybe we'll just say this with my words. Prolactin is going to target mammary glands and stimulate milk production. So all of those are, we said, non-tropic hormones. They're not going to another endocrine gland. They're going to target cells. And that gives me just enough room down here at the bottom to mention the two hormones that we talked about from the posterior pituitary gland. There's only two that we need to know. And remember, if we were being precise here, we said that this posterior pituitary gland didn't actually produce either one of these. Both of these hormones were produced up there in the hypothalamus. And does anybody remember which group of nuclei produced the antidiuretic hormone? Right, we said supraoptic I'm sure the camera's not going to pick this up, but supraoptic nuclei are the ones that produce antidiuretic hormone. And the other one we said, those were paraventricular nuclei, that's right. So paraventricular nuclei are producing this oxytocin. If we think about what antidiuretic hormone does, we said this is going to affect kidney tubules and cause them to retain water. Let's see. Kidney tubules, retention of water. And just to give us a different color, because this is for the first time, everything that we've seen so far has been hormonal, stimulus of release of that particular hormone. Now that we're talking about the posterior pituitary gland, I get to grab a different color. And if we're thinking about antidiuretic hormone or oxytocin, both of these are going to be stimulated to be released by some type of neural stimulus. So we know that posterior pituitary gland is controlled by neural stimulus. We even listed the nuclei that produce these hormones. And I guess the other thing that just kind of jumped into my mind, we mentioned some interactions between different hormones in our lecture. We said sometimes hormones have this synergistic effect where they can amplify the response of each of these hormones. Antidiuretic hormone we're going to see and aldosterone are going to be one of these groups of hormones that have this synergistic effect. I know we mentioned this in our 1406 class, but I don't know if we really did it a lot last semester in here. Any of these ions, like sodium ions or potassium ions or glucose, each of those, they are able to pull on water molecules. In fact, we're going to talk about this a lot in Thursday's lecture. When we think about the stuff in the bloodstream, like my dad is a terrible diabetic. In fact, he now has a sore on his toe that is probably not ever going to heal. And I found that out this weekend. But anyway, your blood, like if you eat a big salty bag of potato chips or if you eat a whole bag of Snickers candy or something like that and your blood is saturated with glucose or saturated with sodium because you ate a bunch of salty potato chips, those molecules like glucose and sodium, they pull on water molecules. And that's why if you eat a bag of potato chips, it's all that salt in your bloodstream is going to be pulling on water molecules from your cells, and your cells are going to get dehydrated, you're going to get thirsty, you're going to want to go drink some water. Basically what I'm trying to say is that water molecules are going to follow around sodium. They're going to follow around glucose too. So one way that we can help conserve extra water is that by conserving glucose, by holding on to glucose in the bloodstream, by holding on to sodium in the bloodstream, then that's going to cause water to also move back into the bloodstream. It follows wherever any of these ions go. You can think of these substances like glucose and sodium as having a pulling force on water molecules, and we call that pulling force osmotic pressure. Right? We're going to compare osmotic pressure, this pulling force, to hydrostatic pressure, which is a pushing force. Like if I had a garden hose and I turned it on full blast, that pushing force is our hydrostatic force. What am I doing over here? Let's get back over here. Antidiuretic hormone, we see it works on kidney tubules and it's going to allow those kidney tubules to retain extra water. This is something that's going to be a hormone that works hand in hand with aldosterone and cortisol. The last one to mention here is oxytocin. We said that oxytocin is something that stimulates the uterine walls. I'll say uterine walls. We can say mammary glands. You can even say the epididymis in males. And what this oxytocin does is it stimulates the contraction of smooth muscles in the walls of the uterine walls is what I'm trying to say, or the epididymis. It's also considered the love hormone. Like I said, if you're cuddling up with somebody on the couch, this is the hormone that's responsible for that nice warm feeling. I guess I'll leave that there. Then with posterior pituitary gland out of the way, I'll leave this open space in the middle and see if we have to fill that later. but I'll just come over here to write some details about the thyroid gland. If I remember from our list in lab, we went over to talk about the thyroid. And in that thyroid gland, there were the two collections of cells that we needed to remember. And somebody just had mentioned the first one, those follicular cells. These follicular cells are going to be the ones that pump out T3 and T4. And we know that T3 and T4, we have it written down over there, those are going to ramp up the metabolic activity of cells. But that wasn't the only cell that we had to know in the thyroid gland. There were the other ones, the parafollicular cells. And these parafollicular cells, can anybody remember what they were pumping out? It was called calcitonin. So calcitonin, this calcitonin is going to go hand in hand with another hormone that we're about to talk about. Calcitonin is going to be something that is going to decrease blood calcium levels. So if we think about what this does, calcitonin is going to decrease, I'll just say blood, maybe that's not obvious, my shorthand for blood calcium levels, let's just say. Decrease blood calcium levels. And we want to make sure that blood calcium levels are kept, relatively extremely tight range. So we have some ability to decrease blood calcium levels if needed. But the other side of calcium control means that we need to look at the next gland that's kind of embedded into the thyroid. We call that the parathyroid gland. I'll just say that. This parathyroid gland, we needed to know that it was capable of producing a hormone that we called parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone did the opposite of calcitonin. Parathyroid hormone is something that was able to increase blood calcium levels. If you want to think about how that does that, remember parathyroid hormone is the thing that is going to stimulate osteoclast to dissolve bone tissue. And so the calcium from that bone tissue goes into the bloodstream and increases it back to its normal levels. Calcitonin, on the other hand, affects those osteoblasts that lay down new bone tissue. And so they take calcium out of the bloodstream and build bone with it. And so that decreases the calcium that's floating freely in the bloodstream. I think we had mentioned that the cells that produce this parathyroid hormone, we call those chief cells. I may be getting into too much detail. I don't remember if that's a quiz question or not. But we've gotten through thyroid gland, parathyroid gland. What's the next one on the lab list? I guess the next one on the lab list is the pineal gland. But before I do, let me try and catch up with what we've been doing so far. T3 and T4, if we just jump back over here, we can see T3 and T4 are released because the thyroid gland was told to release those because of some type of hormonal signal. So we were labeling all of these in this orange color that indicates hormonal stimulus to release T3 and T4. So this is under the influence of hormonal control. There's some type of chemical signal that's telling this thyroid gland, or those follicular cells in particular, to pump out T3 or T4. But for the first time on our list, we are now getting to see something that is controlled by fluid stimulus. We said blood calcium levels have to be tightly regulated, and this calcitonin or parathyroid hormone are stimulated to be released based off of levels in the fluid, in this case, blood plasma. Okay, so now we've got those. Let's keep going. Next one on the list, like I said, was pineal gland, and there's not a whole lot that we have to write about that. I'll say pineal gland. This pineal gland is what produces melatonin. And this melatonin is produced, like we said, by way of some type of neural signal. I mentioned that, where's my neural color? I mentioned that there are neurons in the eye that are not responsible for forming an image at all. And those neurons are sending signals to things like this pineal gland that are just telling it about, is it light outside or is it dark outside? We don't need to see any kind of sharp image. I don't need to tell if that's an E or an F on the chart. I just need to know, is it light or is it dark? And so melatonin is going to be one of these things that's controlled by some type of neural release, some type of neural stimulus. Again, different levels are produced in the wintertime versus the summertime. But the next thing on the list that we talked about and mentioned the hormones that come out of there is the pancreas. We'll talk a lot about the pancreas in terms of its digestive function, but here in the endocrine part of the class, we're thinking about its endocrine function. And the pancreas had two collections of cells. We said there were the, I guess we'll just start with alpha cells, and then we had beta cells. These alpha cells are the ones that were pumping out glucagon. Beta cells were pumping out insulin. And these have opposing effects on one another. We know that glucagon is going to act by increasing our blood calcium, increasing our blood glucose levels. So the G in that case stands for glucose, while insulin is going to be something that opposes glucagon and is going to decrease our blood glucose levels. So whether or not your body is pumping out insulin or pumping out glucagon depends on how much glucose is pumping through your bloodstream. In other words, this is controlled by fluid humoral stimulus. It's just measuring the fluid levels of glucose in the bloodstream. Next, in fact, we have only one more gland to list on here, and I'm just going to jump over here to the middle part of the board since it's the last one that we have. There's two parts, though. This is the adrenal gland. When we're thinking about the adrenal gland, we had to make a distinction. There was the adrenal cortex. And out there in that adrenal cortex, there were the layers that we had to be familiar with. That zona glomerulosa was the outermost. The middle one we said was the zona fasciculata. And the innermost layer was the zona reticularis. Maybe in another color, I can write the hormones that are going to be coming out of those particular layers. This zona glomerulosa is going to be where we see aldosterone produced. Remember, that was the mineral corticoid. The next one, the glucocorticoid, we said was cortisol. That comes from this fasciculata layer. Make sure that's clear. And then the innermost layer, this zona reticularis, is the one that makes these kind of, what's the term I'm trying to say? Generalistic sex hormone that we call androgens. Androgens can be converted into testosterone or estrogen. They're kind of precursor molecules to either one. So this cortex, like we said, was controlled by way of hormonal control. This adrenocorticotropic hormone, adrenal cortex, controlled by hormonal signals. However, when we think about that adrenal medulla, right, the adrenal medulla was a different story. It is instead controlled by neural stimulus. There's a neuron that has a paw right there in the adrenal medulla. And if it sends a signal to the adrenal medulla, it's sending a signal to those chromaffin cells. And these chromaffin cells are going to, in turn, start to pump out epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, let's see how I'm doing. We've got all the glands listed. We've got the names of cells in certain cases like chief cells, follicular cells, parafollicular cells, chromaffin cells. And we've at least, it's not that you're going to have to remember every single hormone and every single trigger of release, but it might be helpful that you're able to give an example of at least one hormone gland, at least one hormone that is released by way of some hormonal control or neural control or humoral control, some type of fluid stimulus. Like if you're thinking of potential essay questions or things that would be good to know as we move from one system into the next, that might be a good take-home message. And we even mentioned, just to kind of lay the groundwork from some stuff that we'll talk about with blood, with antibodies and globulin proteins that are floating around in the bloodstream. Sometimes they have an opposing effect, like we mentioned with this thyroid stimulating immunoglobulin that mimics the effects of thyroid stimulating hormone. If you had this in your bloodstream, like I said, it would be stimulating this thyroid gland to overproduce T3 or T4.
Professor Carter?
Yes?
So wait, which is the humoral control? Was it the adrenal gland? Was that the humoral control? Or is it the hypothalamus?
Let's go to this adrenal gland. So what are you thinking about here for?
Like, is that the humoral control? Because I know we went over the hormonal control, and then you mentioned the neural control, if that makes sense. Like the neural stimulus, and then the hormonal stimulus, and then humoral. That's my question, the humoral side.
And we're just thinking about adrenal gland, right?
Yeah, I'm asking, is the adrenal gland like the humoral control?
Well, the adrenal gland would be either hormonal or neural.
Oh, okay.
And remember that thing looked kind of like a pyramid. And we're saying that the outer part here is going to be all controlled. Well, to use the proper color here, we're going to see the cortex is going to be all controlled by hormones.
Okay.
What am I trying to say? Hormonal control in the cortex versus that direct neural control of the medulla. Right, there was that one neuron that went directly down to the adrenal medulla and could very quickly stimulate that adrenal medulla in seconds to start pumping out epinephrine and norepinephrine. That's why those hormones can get into the bloodstream so quickly. Versus if we wanted to get aldosterone or cortisol or androgens into the system, that is actually going to take a chemical signal that is going to come in the form of Adrenocorticotropic hormone. And Adrenocorticotropic hormone, like we said, is going to be coming from the anterior pituitary gland, but it's only going to be coming from the anterior pituitary gland if the hypothalamus is telling it to do so. So we've got this chain of chemical signals that are going to be controlling the cortex of this adrenal gland, so it's going to be a much slower method of control and release versus that adrenal medulla.
Okay.
Now, if we're thinking of fluid control, those examples are going to be fluid levels of calcium and fluid levels of glucose need to be very tightly regulated.
Yeah.
So I think those are the only ones that we've got so far. Calcitonin and parathyroid hormone, glucagon and insulin. Did that
That makes sense.
get any closer? Let me know if I'm in the way or if I'm getting any other questions. I'm not going to erase this stuff. I feel like we are, I think, through with all of the stuff that I wanted to list in terms of endocrine glands, hormones, and their target cells, but we now have a good opportunity to work through this thyroid case study. And I think I've already said enough things up here to hopefully let you figure this out. Did anybody not get a copy of this thyroid case study? I've got plenty of bonus ones up here if you would like. Let's maybe take about 5 minutes or more, maybe 10 minutes at most. And again, I'll edit this out of the video so we won't have to wait. But grab a partner if you want to and read through this and think about it. See if you can answer some of these questions. And then we're going to go through the correct answers as a group. I'm going to say the first 4 questions are all relevant to what we've been talking about in here, but the last 2 questions, question 5 and 6, are kind of a review from last semester. So it will allow me to tell whether or not you remember that stuff from last semester, or if you were exposed to it ever in the first place. So I'll be quiet for a second, and I'll come around and answer questions if you got them. But then we'll go over the correct answers, and I'll pull this thing down on the overhead in about 5 or 10 minutes. So maybe I'm a little impatient here, but I'm going to go ahead and jump into this and start describing it. And anything that you have written down, maybe you can share with us so that we can think through this as a group. But I'll read kind of through this. This is a thyroid case study in which there is a female whose name is Natasha. She's 19 years old. She's always dieted to keep her weight down. However, in the last 3 months, she's lost about 20 pounds despite a voracious appetite. She complains of nervousness, sleeplessness, and heart palpitations. She notes that she's always very hot and wants the thermostat set lower than her apartment mates. On a physical examination, Natasha is restless and has a noticeable tremor in her hands. It says she's about 5'8". She weighs about 110 pounds. Her arterial blood pressure is 160/85, so that's high. And her heart rate is 110 beats per minute when normal is around 76 beats per minute. Her lower neck appears full, presumable from a goiter. Remember, those were the little lumps that we saw on the anterior part of the neck, indicating that there is an overstimulation of the thyroid gland. So based on all of these symptoms, her physician suspects that Natasha has elevated levels of thyroid hormone. That would be the T3 and T4 that we talked about in her system. So anyway, he suspects there are elevated levels of thyroid hormone in her system. However, the cause of the possible elevated levels of thyroid hormone is unclear, and that's what we're going to try and figure out in this case study. So what the doctor did is he ordered laboratory tests to determine the levels of thyroid hormones in her bloodstream, and the results are here. You can see that the tests have revealed that the levels of T3 and T4 are through the roof. Sure enough, that's likely why she is complaining of being nervous and hot and losing weight despite she's got a voracious appetite. She wants the thermostat set lower than everybody else. You know, her cells are like having this intense workout, burning through energy, and are hotter than normal. This is interesting. The thyroid stimulating hormone, however, is decreased. And that's a little funny, right? Because normally, that's like the 3rd time I've said it if you're keeping track. Thyroid hormone is only going to be pumping out T3 and T4 if it's being told to by the anterior pituitary gland. It's this thyroid stimulating hormone that should be stimulating the thyroid gland. So if we are seeing elevated T3 and T4, you would expect to see elevated levels of thyroid stimulating hormone, because this isn't just going to come from the thyroid gland without some type of stimulus. So it's peculiar, at least at first, why there is low levels of thyroid stimulating hormone. Remember the chain of events here. The hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland controls the thyroid gland. So and what all we are seeing is the end result here, that there's elevated levels of T3 or T4. So we would expect, if this whole chain of hormones is working correctly, elevated levels of T3 and T4 mean elevated levels of thyroid stimulating hormone. And the only way we can get elevated levels of thyroid stimulating hormone is if there are elevated levels of this hypothalamus thyroid releasing hormone. The hypothalamus can stimulate the overproduction and over-release of thyroid stimulating hormone. If that's the case, again, that's another way we would see too much T3 and T4. However, what's peculiar is that there are low levels of T3 and T4. So there are some questions in there, but at least the first one, I think I randomly said some of those already in just my discussion of this, but due to Natasha's symptoms, her physician suspected elevated levels of thyroid hormone. What specific symptoms were based on this, and how are they consistent with increased levels of thyroid hormone? So there were several things you could have said there. Hopefully you put something down about, that her body temperature is increased. She wants the thermostat low. She's got a voracious appetite, but she's still losing weight. Increased heart rate, even the presence of that goiter. Another example. Okay, so we've got all that. Now we're going to move to the second page here where the physician considered the following possible causes. We want to try and figure out why is there too much T3 and T4 being released from that thyroid gland. You know, like we just kind of mentioned how this normally works, how the thyroid is controlled by the anterior pituitary gland and the anterior pituitary gland is controlled by the hypothalamus. So here we have three possible scenarios as to why this thyroid gland is pumping out too much T3 and T4. And what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and figure out which one of these are a possibility and which one of these could not be a possibility. Which one of these can we eliminate? That's what we're trying to do here. So let's take the first one. Here's one possibility for too much T3 or T4 release. It could be that there's increased secretion of that thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. That's what I just said. If there's too much release, let me say that again. In the hypothalamus, if there is too much thyroid releasing hormone, then this is the hypothalamus stimulating the anterior pituitary gland to release thyroid stimulating hormone, and then that thyroid stimulating hormone would cause this thyroid gland to pump out T3 and T4. Is this one possible? Is this what's going on with Natasha? And if so, what makes you think that? And if not, what makes you able to rule this possibility out? What are we thinking?
The decreased levels of TSH, wouldn't that mean the releasing hormones not being released?
I don't know if everybody caught that, but we should be able to rule this out as not a possibility for the reason that she just said. She said if it was the case that thyroid releasing hormone, if it was the hypothalamus that was the cause of this, we would be able to pick that up because we would also see elevated levels of thyroid stimulating hormone, and we don't see that. So you can basically say the elevated, let me say that again, you can say the decreased level of thyroid stimulating hormone tells us that it's not the hypothalamus that's the problem. Okay. Maybe in this second scenario here, letter B says it could be just increased secretion of thyroid stimulating hormone coming directly from the anterior pituitary gland. And sometimes in other case studies, we will see things like proliferative tumors that grow in places and cause additional cells and the overstimulation and release of certain glands. Other cases, there will be destructive tumors that destroy cells and reduce the amount of chemical signals that can be sent. In this case, this scenario is basically saying maybe the anterior pituitary gland is suffering from some type of proliferative tumor in which there might be too much thyroid stimulating hormone coming directly from that anterior pituitary gland, causing this thyroid gland to pump out too much T3 and T4. That should be easily debunked because that's basically saying maybe a tumor is making too much thyroid stimulating hormone and that's causing this release of T3 and T4. What we just know from the previous test is that this is low. The thyroid stimulating hormone is at very low levels in Natasha. So both of these things have to be ruled out. And that takes us to letter C, which is we've got one possibility is hyperactivity of that thyroid gland due to something like Graves' disease. And remember, Graves' disease, that's the autoimmune disease in which your body is pumping out this newly shaped protein that mimics the effects of thyroid stimulating hormone. This protein is called TSI, that thyroid stimulating immunoglobulin. That's a possibility here. We can't rule this out. Glands, we'll also see this a lot in the body. Your body doesn't want to waste energy. So if there is already a bunch of T3 and T4 in the bloodstream, your body is going to, what am I trying to say there? The anterior pituitary gland is able to detect that there's sufficient levels of T3 and T4 in the bloodstream, so there's no need for this anterior pituitary gland to further stimulate more T3 and T4. So this high levels of T3 and T4 in the bloodstream can have an opposing effect on the levels of thyroid stimulating hormone. Right? That's not needed if we already have too much T3 and T4 in the bloodstream. Let's look at the next series of questions that we have here. Actually, I skipped over one at the bottom. How does the presence of that goiter support the decision in number 2? In Graves' disease, again, that thyroid-stimulating immunoglobulin is working directly on that thyroid gland and causing that thyroid gland to overproduce T3 and T4. So you would have a swollen thyroid gland. This does seem to lend credit to the idea that it is Graves' disease, that there's that presence of a goiter is indicating that there's an overactive thyroid gland. We just haven't nailed down why is that thyroid gland overactive yet. And that's where number 4 comes in. There is an additional test that can be done. So if you're ever in one of these situations like this, the test that you want to, lab work that you want to have done is test for this TSI. You do a TSI test to test for that thyroid stimulating immunoglobulin. And if levels of that come back high, then it's an indication of potential Graves' disease. Again, autoimmune disease, your body's just producing proteins that mimic the effects of thyroid-stimulating hormone. The last 2 questions really kind of get us into last semester, but it's worth reviewing because we'll see some more of it going forward. Remember that Natasha had an irregular heartbeat. It was beating way too fast. Her blood pressure was also elevated, indicating that the heart is beating too forcefully and forcing too much blood through the vessels. So one of the things the doctor prescribed was the beta-1 blockers. Which of those symptoms would be treated by the beta-1 blocker? Maybe the first question is beta-1. Where do we find those beta-1 receptors at? What does your brain think of when you hear beta-1 receptors? Good guess. Also a good guess. So pancreas, there we're thinking alpha-2. Alpha-1 was most blood vessels. Alpha-2 was digestive organs. What are you thinking?
Blood pressure.
It has something to do with blood pressure. We're thinking beta-1 receptors. This is an adrenergic receptor, so adrenaline, epinephrine and norepinephrine are going to be binding to these beta-1 receptors. We said they're found in only one place in the body.
Is it the heart wall?
The muscular heart wall. So let's grab one of these heart models over here. And there were all different types of adrenergic receptors. We said alpha-1, alpha-2, beta-1, beta-2, and beta-3. Beta-2, those were the ones in the walls, the smooth muscle in the walls of the blood vessels that go to skeletal muscles. Beta-2 is also in the coronary blood vessels. But I'm asking here about beta-1. Beta-1 is going to be here in the myocardium, that muscular wall that does the actual pumping. So Natasha's heart was pumping too quick and too forcefully. So by giving her a beta-1 blocker, this is going to block those adrenergic receptors on the muscular wall of the heart. And that's going to reduce the frequency and the strength at which that heart beats. And the symptom that we're trying to treat there is the increased blood pressure and heart rate. I guess I just answered question 6 there. How will that beta-1 blocker treat these symptoms? Well, we know beta-1 receptors are on the heart wall. They're excitatory. Epinephrine and norepinephrine will cause them to contract more quickly and more forcefully, and we don't want that to happen. So we want to block those receptors so that they don't ever know epinephrine or norepinephrine is there. I think that's it. Did I go too quick through any one of those? Rose, you good back there? Okay, we'll do more of those case studies as we go through. I just, really think when we're talking about the endocrine glands, I mentioned last time, it's kind of tough because you're talking about these collection of scattered glands that affect all kind of different target tissues, and they do all kind of different things. So it's hard to put that into some type of framework, but maybe writing it on the board, that second time after we had our first lecture will help you sort these things in your brain. I am a big fan of making note cards with these things, or obviously case studies that you're thinking about them. But without getting into any of the blood stuff, are there any questions about the case study at all? Receptors or anything?
You haven't turned N.
It is not.
On
No.
So is there separate ones on D2L that were graded?
There are more that I have planned later in the semester that will be for a grade. This one I just kind of brought in here for us to work through as a group, just to kind of give you something to think about. Examples basically of hormonal or neural or humoral stimulus. You can bet that you're probably going to see a question that wants you to give examples of one of each of those at some point. So my goal here was to get you feeling like that you're comfortable and you're able to do something like that. If there aren't any questions about the case study, then I'll consider our lecture done and I'll turn the camera off. We can take a little break and then I will switch into lab mode if you want me to run around and answer questions about those lab models.